So I've had many people ask me what decks I would recommend for beginners, or what decks are a little more complex or difficult for people to execute, especially with less experience into the format. So I wanted to do a little tier list video that kind of puts an emphasis on that, you know, ranking some of these decks and explaining whether or not they would be good for beginners. This is for those people that are either new to the format or those who are trying to introduce people to the format, and you want a good idea of what decks to try to suggest to people to play, or what decks maybe to have on hand for like people to try, right? You know, I know a lot of people actually buy extra decks or like, you know, loaner decks to try to help people get into a format, and I feel like this is going to be a helpful video for you if you're looking for suggestions. I already actually made this video once, but I decided to scrap it because there was just quite simply too many decks. I had every deck on my website, tcgrewind.com. There's more decks to the format than what you're gonna see here, but I put an emphasis on the decks that are within this pool, mostly because I feel like they're either decks that someone could like probably likely be drawn to when entering the format, or something that people would want to maybe try while converting from like Edison format, for example, right? So like if someone is an Edison player, they might want to play Vayu, Turbo, and Tengu, and that's actually completely fine, and there's builds for that. So I wanted to kind of put decks in here that I felt are actually likely for someone to maybe want to start out in the format with. More so than just every single deck on my website, because like, you know, realistically, I don't think I'm going to see a ton of people who are wanting to play Battery Man or something like that. You know, like maybe it's possible, but for the sake of keeping this video a little bit more short and simple for some of the newer players out there, I wanted to condense this down to things I could reasonably see a larger majority of people wanting to play. So that's where we're going to start off today. We're going to get right into this tier list, and we're going to actually start with Tengu plants and agents. But before I jump right into that, I probably should go over our tiers. So we have, at the bottom, we have beginner. So this is a deck that I think is very beginner friendly, like something that I think you should recommend to your friends who are either new to the game or new to the format, because they're pretty easy to pilot, and they let your players like focus on what your opponent's doing and like learning just like very basic fundamentals of the format. Mild Complexities is going to be a deck that I'd say is fairly easy, but maybe just has a little bit more depth, or like maybe one specific combo in it that like, or like one specific gimmick in it that you really need to understand. Difficult is going to be something where I think the deck has quite a few complex lines, but it's not like insane. And then complex, I think, is going to be like, I would definitely not recommend this deck to beginners in the format, or just beginners for the game in general, because the deck is very complex. Like there's a lot to learn about the deck specifically, and especially if it's like very deck specific, that doesn't really help get you into the format, right? So we'll just jump right into it. We'll start, like I said, Tengu plants and agents are the ones that people really bring up to me the most when talking about like, hey, what deck should I try, or what should I start with? You know, people really ask about these two a lot. So for agents, I actually think the deck is very beginner friendly. I think there's not a lot of complex lines to agents. You are either A, summoning a tour guide to get Sanguine, which could search your Earth if you don't have Earth or Venus, or you're going to summon Earth to search a Venus, or you're going to summon Venus to get your Shine Balls, do your Gachi combo. None of the lines are very complex. This is one of the decks that actually tilts me a lot when I watch in tournament and people take big thonk turns on this deck. I think they're just slow playing, because like, this deck at its core really isn't that deep or complex. It really doesn't have crazy lines or anything like that. Occasionally you can pull off some like cool combo with like Tour Guide, Levier stuff, but for the most part, it's pretty beginner friendly. I don't think this deck is very difficult to play at all. On the other hand, I do think Tengu plants is difficult. Like, I would put this deck, it's not complex, but I will say it's difficult in the sense that you have resources in your graveyard. For example, like Spore and Glow Up, and this is something I teach people when I like coach them in League of Legends. There's like a concept of just because you have an ability available to use doesn't mean you should use it. Like, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And I think that's the case for Tengu plants, where like, you know, you shouldn't always just use Slam, Spore, or Glow Up just because they're in the grave. You should, like, you know, think about what you want to do, like consider board control. The lines are just a bit deeper. That being said, the one thing I'll say for like like Tengu Plants is I have seen people pilot this deck extremely poorly, play like very reckless and just completely get away with it. So like, I don't think it's like crazy. Like, I don't think it's a terrible deck to start on, but I would say like if you're really super new to the format or the game in general, I would say like I would definitely recommend Agents over Plants. That being said, we got Black Wings, and I'd say this deck is fairly beginner friendly, especially if you're an Edison player converting to Tengu. This deck is fine. It's not like, you know, obviously this tier list isn't about how good a deck is, but I think you'd be more than fine taking this deck over and like being completely comfortable. It's a lot worse in Tengu Plant format than it is in Edison, just because of the fact that, you know, we have like Gale and Whirlwind and Kalut all at one. But for the most part, this deck's pretty simple. It's really not hard to play, and I think the same thing goes for Edison. I don't think this deck has too much depth to it. Chaos. This is just like a generic Chaos build. I do have Cat Sith on here as well as Piper Chaos, because these are kind of like the popular lines for Chaos, so we can do all the Chaos decks at once. I think that's just about everything here. But Chaos, I'd say like this version is very beginner friendly, like just like the standard, like I'm playing good cards and we are playing for Chaos stuff. You're not really doing anything too crazy. You know, I would say this is pretty easy. With Piper Chaos, I would say this deck has mild complexities, just because of the fact that like the big difference between Piper Chaos and like standard Chaos is like Piper Chaos has like the decision line of like, is it always worth to summon Piper and get the draw, or like do you actually have to put something useful on the board, you know, like, and knowing how to play around your opponent's decks and when to do what, I think it makes Piper Chaos a little bit more difficult to play than just like a standard Chaos build. That being said, I think Cat Sith is actually pretty beginner friendly. I don't think it's very hard or like difficult to like pull off. I'd say that for the most part, Cat Sith lines are like pretty simple. You know, like again, you're filling your graveyard, you're pitching Cat Sith to pop stuff. I don't think it's anything that a new player wouldn't be able to follow or understand. I think it just gets slightly more complex with Piper Chaos, but keep in mind, I would still probably recommend either of these tiers for beginners, just because it's like, okay, but just recognize that this deck's a little bit more complex. Dragons, I put this in here again because of Edison format. I'd say this is pretty beginner friendly, but again, this deck isn't like very good in the format, or like there's a lot better ways to build it than like standard like Disaster Dragons. But for the most part, this deck is relatively beginner friendly. I don't think the lines are very deep or complex. Diva Hero, I would say, has mild complexities, but I do actually recommend this for beginners, especially Edison players switching over. I think this deck is still fine in Tengu, and I think it even like gets some nice buffs with like, I think it's cool to play Diva Hero where you have like Miracle Fusions and then you have Tour Guides, and like, you know, I'll have the build on the screen, but like I think this deck is actually fairly good for new players. But it is just slightly more complex in terms of like your decision making and stuff like that, I'd say, compared to these down here. Exodia, I didn't put a lot of alternate win cons in. In fact, this is the only like weird deck like that, but I could see a world where someone's like a classic, they want to play Exodia, and I'd say this deck is actually fairly beginner friendly. It's pretty easy to play. I don't think it's that terrible. In fact, I'd like to say it's like a little bit better than Dragons, maybe, I don't know. But it's not, yeah, it's not that bad, and I think you could actually recommend this to a new player. They'd be fine with it. Fabled. We recently saw some success with Fabled for like qualifying for Tengu Worlds. I will say that I think this deck is a bit more difficult, just because you have to operate under, like, this is a very special summon heavy deck. You have to play under Max C, you have to know how to like handle those situations and have like a lot of backup plans to like the decisions you're making. But I don't think it's like super easy. And then like, yeah, there's some decision lines with like going into Ragin versus like summoning like a Catastor, stuff like, you know, stuff like that. So I would say this deck is a bit more difficult than like the other ones. Fish, I include this because of Edison. I could maybe see someone wanting to start the format playing Fish in Tengu. It's a lot worse because we don't have Fishboard Blaster, but I think it is semi-playable. The only issue is, I think I'd put it in like mild complexities. Like obviously you're going for the Super Ancient Deep Sea Coelacanth combo, and that's all fine and dandy. But knowing how to play when you don't have that, like, and also operating with like a lot of bricks, it's not necessarily easy. Flamvel on the other hand, very easy, like very easy to play. I don't think I included like Flamvel Sworn, but Flamvel Sworn are like the same thing. And I think both are totally fine. Super easy decks to understand and play. Like I would definitely recommend these decks to beginners. X-Sabers, I have one for X-Sabers and then like for traps and decree. So we have like trap build, decree build right here. And I think there is actually a difference. I literally was just asked this question the other day, so that's why I like decided to include it, because people have talked to me about this before. I think that decree sabers is complex, and like trap sabers is like difficult, but it's easier than decree sabers. And I'd say the reason why that is because with trap sabers, I think you have a bit more forgiveness on terms of like making mistakes, because you have defensive tools. With decree sabers, the only defensive tools you really have are going to be your own X-Saber monsters as well as like effect failure. And if you use effect failure poorly, you're gonna lose the game off of it. Like that's just the reality. You have to know when to use your hand traps, like what hand traps to use, you know, stuff like that. And so I'd say this deck, like because it has no defensive tools, you're playing kind of glass cannon. It's really important you know exactly what monster to summon, when to summon it, like what monsters to search off Dark Soul. I see people misplay with X-Sabers all the time. It is a very difficult deck to play. That being said, I think like if you have traps, you can like kind of, again, you can make up for the mistakes by just having the defensive tools. If you have like Deep Prison Set, they swing and you banish, you know, like you can out boards, where like with Decree Sabers, you are all inning on like your knowledge of the format and like the archetype strength itself. So it gets a little more confusing. So I would say if you're gonna like try to like, if you know you want to bring X-Sabers in to like recommend to new players, I would definitely say that Trap Sabers is the way to go for newer players or new people into the format if they want to try it. But I really wouldn't recommend X-Sabers in general to new players, if I'm being honest. Like I think this deck is pretty difficult to play in Tengu. Gadgets, and we'll do Machina gadgets with it. Both these decks are very beginner friendly, super easy. You know, like summon a gadget, summon a like a Machina monster, search a card, set some back row. Nothing really deep to it, nothing too difficult to figure out. So I would definitely, like, I think this deck is totally fine for beginners. Gallus FTK, this is basically agents, but I'd say it has mild complexities in the sense that you're operating without spell or trap cards. I don't think it's too difficult to play, but, and I don't even know if I would recommend this deck to beginners, but I can't say it's, like, difficult. So, like, it's, like, I think it's fine. Gravekeeper is very beginner friendly. This deck is pretty good, pretty easy, and yeah, there's not a lot of depth to it. It's one of those decks that I think is like kind of frowned upon in the format, but also respected, you know what I'm saying? But I don't think this deck really has anything crazy it's doing. It's pretty easy for a new player to pick up and play. We have Herald of Perfection. I think this goes alongside Gallus FTK with like, it's like kind of like Agents, but just has slightly like a few more gimmicks to it. And so I think that it's slightly more complex. Again, pretty beginner friendly as still though. Like I don't think it's like too deep. It's actually a really cool deck. But for the most part, it's kind of like one and the same with Agents, right? So we're just kind of putting them all together. Ice Barriers. I know, weirdly enough, there's some people that are big fans of this archetype. So I would say that this deck is actually pretty beginner friendly. It's kind of basically just Monarchs, right? And I don't think Monarchs are too difficult to play. In fact, we'll put Monarchs right next to it in the beginner friendly like category. I think like for the most part, once you set up your Treeborn, you're just kind of making like tribute summon plays. The most complex line is like Econ with Treeborn, but I feel like everyone in the world knows that combo at this point, so it's not like there's nothing really to it. Karkuri, I would also put up in complex. Main reason for that is because of the must attack if able clause. It's really easy for players to mess that up, and then also operating under Max C and like your decision making around like what to do when getting hand trapped, stuff like that. But for the most part, the must attack if able clause, like that is something that can really burn an inexperienced player. And so it's a bit more complex of a deck. I don't know if I would, like, you could technically put it in difficult as well. I don't know if it's like super complex, but I'd say for the most part, it's fair to say, like, I don't think I would recommend this to like brand new players of the format or brand new players in general. Water Synchro, this is basically Tengu plants without the Tengu. And I think like we have Cloudy and Synchro, all these decks kind of go in the same category. They're very similar. They operate very similarly to Tengu plants. And so I think that like they're semi-difficult to play, like in the sense of, again, you have a lot of decision trees. You got to cook up a lot of plays in the moment that aren't super intuitive when compared to, like, you know, the decks we have down here. But, you know, they're still fine. Lightsworn, this is also a very beginner-friendly deck. I mean, y'all already know how Lightsworn operates. You know, I'm sure we've all lost to our fair share of, like, terrible Lightsworn players that just mill really well and they have a great game, you know? So, this deck is totally beginner-friendly. Macrocosmos, this is actually getting some popularity. People are playing it with like Grenma Ju. In fact, I probably should update my lists on the website because we've seen multiple topping lists with like Grenma Ju now. But for the most part, pretty easy. Set up Macrocosmos and you got some like cool plays. Malefic, I also think is fairly beginner friendly, and this archetype is actually fairly popular. A lot of people like it. So I think it actually has seen recent success somewhere. I want to say like it was like Playtest IRL's channel, and someone like won with this deck or something, which was impressive because I think this deck kind of sucks. But a lot of people like it, and yeah, I'd say it's like pretty easy. You set up a field spell, you summon a big boy, and then you're trying to beat your opponent down with that. Mist Valley, this is like pure Mist Valley, especially when it comes to some of these hidden arsenal archetypes. I wanted to include them because that's like one of the big differences you get from here to like Edison, right? Is you get a lot more archetypes, a lot more decks to play. And so hidden arsenal archetypes are ones a lot of people like to mess with when they come switch to Tengu. So Mist Valley is definitely one of them, and it's a pretty cool deck, but I would say it's fairly difficult. There's actually some pretty complex combo lines, which we saw in my... in like some of our recent qualifier tournaments for Worlds. We saw someone actually qualify with Mist Valley, and I would say that this deck is actually pretty difficult. Same thing goes for Morphotronics. I actually think this deck is difficult. There's weird lines that aren't super intuitive, and the combo lines actually can be kind of deep with Morphotronics depending on how you build it. But again, this is like an anime archetype. I could see someone wanting to come over and play it and give it a try, because I actually think it's like fairly decent in Tengu Plant form. I like it. Don't sleep on this deck. It's not that bad. But yeah, I think that it is kind of difficult. I don't think it's like super easy or intuitive of what to do at given times. Especially when it comes to like the Leviair combos with like remote and stuff like that. Naturia though, pretty beginner friendly. And I would say that for the most part, it's not difficult to follow what to do. You're going to, you know, play for bamboo, shoot, try to stop your opponent from playing the... I guess, like, maybe we could say there's, like, mild complexities, but I don't think so. I think for the most part, Naturia is, like, fairly easy to play, and it's, yeah, it's not too bad. We have Psychics, and I would say Psychics have, like, mild complexities, probably mild complexities on Psychics. This deck's pretty easy in the sense that everything's floater, but we'll probably add TG stun and then like pure TG into this mix here as well, and I'd say like they're probably on the higher end of like semi-complex. Like they're fairly easy in the sense that they're back row decks, right? Like when it comes to TG stun, but all of them have the same problem of like you have to remember to search a TG in the end phase. All these decks play it. Psychics, the complexity comes in with like Esper Girl versus like getting another witch, or like knowing what to summon off of Witch. I see a lot of people just hard go for Esper Girl, and it's not always best. And so I think there's some complexities to it, but for the most part, these decks aren't super difficult to play or understand. They're still fairly okay for beginners. The only hard part, again, for TG players is like, especially if they're newer to the game, remembering an end phase search effect. If you forget it, you lose it, and I feel like that feels kind of bad since it's not like mandatory. So that's where there's like some mild complexities for like TG and then like Psychics as well. Then we have Lancer Frogs, and this is kind of basically Monarchs, but I think it actually has mild complexities. There's weird lines with like using Ronin Totem to like banish a bunch of cards to set up for Lancer and stuff like that. And so it's, I don't know if it's like, it's not quite as simple as just like tributing for a Monarch, which is why I'd give it a little edge in terms of difficulty, but I don't think it's crazy. Scraps, I think, are actually also very beginner friendly, pretty strong deck. And for the most part, I don't think there's a lot of depth to Scraps. Like, you know, no offense to Scrap players, but it's like, for the most part, your goal is synchro into Scrap Dragon and then use it to control the field, and like you're usually using Tengu and stuff like that, or like a lot of back row. Really simple strategy to follow. I don't think a lot of people struggle with like playing Scraps. 6 Samurai, I think, would have some like mild complexities, just in the sense that there's like gateway plays, knowing, you know, what to do, and like, I guess, like, for the most part, you're just setting up back row and, like, making a Shien or Nat Beast trying to protect it. I don't think it's, like, crazy, but I do think there are some, like, smaller combo lines this deck has that maybe aren't super intuitive to the average, like, player, or, like, someone who's super experienced in the format. Okay, so we have Hero Stun and then, like Chaos Heroes. I actually think Hero Stun is very easy to play. Like, I think this is one of the... Like, this alongside Gravekeeper is probably one of the most beginner-friendly, like, back row decks, in the sense that, like, you're basically just setting a back row and playing your deck. When it comes to the Chaos Heroes, like, with, like, Tour Guide and, like, BLS, stuff like that, I think it's slightly more complex, just because there's some combo lines, but for the most part, yeah, honestly, I don't think so. I think you could rope these up. It's not... The lines are pretty simple. You're summoning one monster a turn and then maybe dropping a BL. Right, so it's not crazy. Spellcasters I put on here because in terms of like a deck for beginners, deck's like fairly good. I also think it's like pretty decent. Like, no one really messes with this deck, but I always talk about this deck. I think it's good. So yeah, I think this is fine for beginners. I know there's like an Edison list like this, and like, but for like context in Tengu, it's significantly better because there's way less spot removal to get rid of Secret Village of the Spellcasters, stuff like that. Like, people's spell trap remover isn't Raiko or Caius, it's now MST, which means that Secret Village of the Spellcasters actually goes up a lot in value. So I actually think this deck is fairly decent for beginners. It's not very popular. I don't really ever see anyone play it, but I do think this one is like decent if you want to like try something a little more spicy coming into the format. Bayou Turbo I think is actually kind of difficult. Big difference between Blackwing and Bayou Turbo is Blackwing kind of plays like a, you know, like a stun deck. It's not like doing anything super crazy, but Bayou Turbo I think has like, you know, you have to kind of think about your extensions and play for like OTKs, and like, I don't think it's super intuitive of what to do and how to use it, especially as like a new player. I'd say Bayou Turbo is a little more difficult. Worms I think have some mild complexities. I'd say it's like fairly beginner friendly, but it gets a little more complex when it comes with like side decking and like when you have like W Nebula and Meteorite, people use interactions with like Fossil Dyna, stuff like that, to like nuke your opponent's special summons and then prevent them from special summoning. There's some weird gimmicks with it, and so, and like, yeah, so I don't think it's like super intuitive, but it is pretty easy. Like, I would definitely recommend Worms to beginner if they wanted to try it. Zombies I'm actually going to put up in complex. I think this deck is not forgiving to mistakes at all. I think it it's like similar to X-Sabers, where you need to search the right card at the right time, and you kind of got to pre-plan your turns, and if you mess anything up, you're going to lose. And so I don't think I would recommend it to beginners, but if you're like an experienced zombie player in Edison and you want to switch over, I think that's fine. I think you could probably get away with doing it, but I do think this does require quite a bit of format knowledge of Tengu format to execute well, so it might take a bit more practice to... Falcon Punch, I think, is very complex. It might be one of the most, probably next to, like, Infernity or something, which we'll get there. That's, like, cool. But, you know, we'll put it up here anyway. Infernity, I think, is far and away the most complex. But we'll talk about both these two. Infernity is very difficult in the sense that you have very specific combo lines, and, like, there's a lot of crazy ways to, like, I guess, initiate a combo, and if you get that combo off and do it correctly, you're gonna win the game. But if you mess up any step in that combo, you can make your hand and everything you did completely unplayable. Like if you actually add a card at the wrong time, can't summon or whatever, it can screw everything up. This deck is easily the most complex in Tengu Plant format, and I think Falcon Punch is up there, not in the sense that the deck is like super hard to play or figure out how it functions. I think it gets complex when you use, like, when playing against specific matchups, and like I think you have to really have a lot of deep knowledge of Tengu format to execute this deck well. Just as an example, I recently was playing Falcon Punch at a, like, you know, at our like Tengu local we have going on now. And one thing I did was, like, when playing against Tengu plants, is there was a lot of times where you would like call the Haunted back a DD Crow, then bounce that DD Crow to like pitch it to like get rid of a dark or a light, like to prevent your opponent from summoning BLS. Like there's a lot of weird lines like that where you start like playing to control your opponent's graveyard, and depending on your matchup, knowing what to do while using, like, you have like one of each hand trap, when to recycle them, all that stuff. It's a little weird, and it's not very intuitive. I think it takes format knowledge, because you have to be able to predict what is going to happen and what your opponent is going to do. So I would definitely not recommend this deck for beginners. It's fantastic if you understand the format pretty well, but it's pretty poor if you do not. Counter Fairies, I'd say, is fairly beginner friendly, but I'll put it with mild complexities. The only reason is because, like, you're using spell speed 3, and so that can be kind of confusing for like a new player, as well as like remembering all your effects after the counter traps resolve, like drawing the card, stuff like that. I think it's kind of easy for newer players to like mess that up, but for the most part, it's setting back row and doing stuff like that. I think this deck is fairly easy. TG Agents, I think, is also very beginner friendly. It's basically just a different way to play Agents. It has like kind of deeper combo lines with like Striker into Venus, but for the most part, it's fairly easy. I don't think anyone would really struggle with this deck. Jurax, I would say, is, honestly, I kind of want to put Jurax in complex. I'd say this is like borderline difficult to complex, but the issue with Jurax is it kind of operates in its own world, where like you really have to play around Velo, and then you have like those damage trap spell cards like Lance and Shrink, and knowing when to set them and when not to set them is actually really critical to this deck's success. It's really weird. So yeah, this deck seems fairly simple when you like look at it on paper, but I think in execution there's actually a lot of depth to Jurax and like how to execute it properly, especially with like, there's a lot of times where like you kill a Velo and then you summon back Aolo, then you Aolo back into Velo so you can slowly fill your grave, but you want to keep Velo in rotation. It's kind of weird stuff like that. Yeah, so I would say this deck is actually fairly difficult to play. Rock Stun. This deck is like, I'd say pretty beginner friendly, honestly. Actually, no, we'll do mild complexities. Revealing in the end phase for your rock monsters actually can sometimes be something you forget, especially as a newer player. You could lose monsters for it, which could potentially lose you the game, you know, that's not always fun. But for the most part, this deck is pretty simple. You're just controlling the game with your big rock monsters. I put a new updated build on my website for this deck, and I think it's pretty good. I think it's like pretty cool, and I think people should give it a try. So, you know, it was my little pseudo ad for it, but I don't think that this deck is like terrible for beginners. We included Ancient Gear because this deck has some play in Edison. I think it's fairly beginner friendly as well. I actually think Ancient Gear Beast is really good in Tengu Plant format because there's so many more floaters and cards that like when destroyed by Ancient Gear Beast actually hurt your opponent a lot to lose. So I think this deck is fairly decent, depending on how you build it, but it is pretty cool. And I don't think, you know, if you're an Edison player and you want to give this one a try, I think it'd honestly be fine. It's not bad. We have Gate Heroes. I think Gate Heroes are actually fairly difficult. Reason for that is because like you're kind of always playing for that single combo. You have to know, one, how to execute that combo, so unless you've like learned it, you don't know. And then you also have like kind of decision lines when you don't have that combo, like how you want to play, what you want to do, and how you want to play around things like Valor and stuff like that. What to do when you're max seed, mid combo, stuff like that. You know, like there's some complex decision trees to it. I don't think it's super intuitive. Like you're not just setting back row and summoning a monster every turn. It's not crazy difficult, but I'd say it's not super beginner friendly. But I could reasonably see people wanting to like come to the format and play this. Junk Doppel. This deck, I think, is like fairly difficult, kind of along the same lines as like Tengu Plants, but honestly maybe more difficult. This deck is really weak to Max C and like has kind of a lot more, there's a lot more things you can do in a single turn with Junk Doppel. It's like a little bit more explosive at the cost of being weaker to Max C, but knowing what to do, when to do it, I think is a little difficult. And so, yeah, I don't know if this would be a very beginner-friendly deck, although it's a lot of fun. And I'm sure like this is like pretty nostalgic for people. So like if you have experience with the deck already, then I would say go for it. But if you're like a beginner to the game or beginner to the format entirely, I would say like if you're gonna think, like maybe try Tengu Plants first and then move to Junk Doppel if you want. Gladiator Beast I think is actually fairly difficult as well. Reason for this is with Gladiator Beast, like I mean Gladiator Beast players already know this, right? Like it is easy to mess up with Gladiator Beast, like if you make the wrong decision, or if you just play into the wrong thing, you can kind of get blown out and just like lose the game pretty easily. Especially, I'd say this deck is way more fragile in Tengu than it is in Edison. I think it's like a little bit better in Edison. So like, if you're playing Gladiator Beast, like I think you need to have the knowledge of the deck. I don't think it's like super great for beginners. You do have to learn it. But that being said, like for the most part, if you have experience with the deck, I think you'd be fine. Gen X, I actually think this deck is like fairly difficult as well. I don't even know how you play it, to be honest. Like this is like the Psychon list that's on my website. It's like, you know, whatever he was cooking. It's like, it's an ultimate offering deck, and I've seen Psychon do some weird stuff with it. I wouldn't encourage it for beginners. I still haven't even figured out how you play it yet. So, like, if I haven't figured it out, then I'm not going to expect a beginner to, right? So, yeah. We have Nordic, and Nordic, I'd say, is fairly difficult. Not because the deck is, like, crazy complex in terms of what it's looking to do. It becomes complex when your opponent figures out, or if they already know what Nordic does. Right, so like if they know how to play around what you're doing, that's when things get unique and you have to be creative with your decision making. And I don't think that's super intuitive or easy to do. Like that's when the deck goes from being like pretty strong to like pretty difficult, right? So it's definitely playable, but like, and it's like fairly easy to know what to do when your opponent's playing into you. But once they stop, knowing how to like take this deck and like still win with it after that your opponent like realizes what you're doing, that's when it becomes very difficult. Dragoonity is probably one of the most beginner friendly decks out there. I heavily recommend this deck to beginners. I think it's really good, and I also think it is stupid easy. Like, you are using the field spell, search a duck, summon the ducks, make a level 8 synchro. Like, the decision lines are so simple every turn in this deck, and I think it's very, very easy to execute. Probably one of the most, like, this, I'd say, like, usually when people ask me what decks to play, I typically do recommend these, like, top decks right here. So it's like Dragoonity, Agents, or even TG Agents, and then like Gravekeeper Hero, like, or some type of Chaos list, right? Like, I always say those are like the best decks to like try to learn the format with. They're super easy. So yeah, like, I kind of wanted to rank these in terms of how good they are as well. You know, I probably should bump this up here, I think. But yeah, I think, like, I wanted to rank these in terms of how, like, strong they are in the format a bit for the beginner decks, just so people are kind of aware. But any lit deck down here is going to be so fantastic for a new player. We have Evil Hero, and this deck does see play in Edison, or has seen play in Edison. I'd say this deck is fairly difficult, unless you have experience with it. So, this deck is, like, it has like a really weird extra deck, not very intuitive extra deck, and weird lines of like what to do in terms of like setting up your graveyard. There's some weird cards in the deck, like you know, Big Piece Golem or whatever. You know, just kind of it's just kind of a weird deck. So unless you really know what you're doing, I don't think I'd recommend it. But it is, you know, like again, if you're an Edison player switching over, you probably know what to do. It's just I think this is going to be a little bit more difficult to play than like a standard hero deck if you're learning the format. And then Dragon Turbo, I recently added this to my website. I would say this deck is difficult to like maybe mild complexities. I think it plays similarly to how it plays in Edison. I think I'll put mild complexities. Maybe Leigh Murphy will disagree. I don't really know. I don't have a ton of experience with this deck myself, but on paper it seems pretty simple to me. I could be wrong about it. You know, I don't know. I haven't really messed with it before. But for the most part, I'd say like outside of the very basic fundamentals of like, you know, you got to draw a lot of cards and set up a big board, try to OTK. I don't think it's like there's a ton to think about in terms of what your decision making is in a single turn. But yeah, maybe we could say difficult. I don't know. It doesn't operate like any of the other decks down here where it's like a little bit easier, where you're like setting back row or like have a very linear play per turn. So there's probably some decision trees within this I don't really know. So I might put it in difficult, but maybe lower end difficult, you know. But I think that's going to wrap it up for this tier list, guys. You know, just quick recap. You can play any of these decks if you really want to, or if you have experience with them. Like if you played any of these historically and you're coming back, then, you know, by all means. And like just because something's complex doesn't mean I would say like don't play it. But I will say, you know, if you're new to the format or new to the game, I would definitely try to stick to playing decks down here, just to try to get the hang of things. I think Agents is like another phenomenal start. It's a pretty powerful deck in the format, and then like, you know, you can play against Tengu plants to kind of figure out what Tengu plants do before you try to pick up plants, if you want to like do it, because these are the two a lot of people put focus on. But for the most part, I think this is a really solid starting point, like down here, for like anything you want to try if you're like switching over from Edison, or if you just want to like, you know, or if you're just starting the format generically and you want to give it a go. These decks down here are going to be your best bet of something to like get into the game, or to like suggest to a friend. You know, like I think for me, for example, I'm doing loner decks for some people looking to get into Tengu plant locally, and like Dragoonity and TG Stun are actually very cheap decks to pick up. They're super cheap and they're pretty easy. So like Dragoonity, I think it's fantastic if you have a very new player to the format. If someone like is a semi-experienced player, then like I don't think TG is too crazy to do either. So I think either of those are like fantastic options, especially to like if you're buying loner decks. Agents is also fairly cheap, but there's a few pricier cards, like Herald of Orange Light is a little like, I mean, it's pricey in the sense it's like $3. You know, that's like if you're loaning out cards, you know, like a lot of the other cards like Dragoonity or like TG Sun are like literally 10 cents each. So just something to think about. But for the most part, like I said, that's going to wrap it up for this video. Let me know if you guys found this helpful. We are going to give a quick shout out to my patrons. So shout out to Wabi Adam, Eric Gagnon, Hobanite, My Dude, Photo Shooty, Brian Ford, and Sven Albran. Thank you guys so much for the support. Other than that, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe, and have a great time doing it.